Now? Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for attending the first YOL Development live market briefing dedicated to the application processor market. My name is David Jordan and I am Global Sales Support and Coordination Manager for YOL Development. So based on our application processor monitor, this live market briefing will provide you a 30-minute up-to-date analysis of the market. And we will also focus on the COVID-19 impacts. Our computing and software expert, John Lawrence, technology and market analyst at YOL Development, will examine the changes to our market outlook in the context of our prior forecast, and also present what he sees as the most likely outcome during this very uncertain time. So before we get started, I remind you that you can submit questions to our analysts during all the live event using the Ask a Question window at the bottom of the screen. Question will be answered right after the presentation. And in case we have not enough time, we will follow up with you by email. To conclude, this live event is recorded and you will receive tomorrow an email with the link to access to the recorded session. So let's start the webcast and welcome John. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Wanted to talk about a little bit what exactly APUs are. There's a little bit of a, if you look out in the industry, the definition of APUs can be somewhat nebulous. So I wanted to get very specific just to make sure we're all speaking the same language through the rest of this. Is that what's distinct about APUs is we're talking about a processor chip that is combining multiple logic processing elements into a single chip. Many times it's referred to as an SoC or a system on a chip. And what the different processing elements that you'll see integrated onto a single SoC application processor could be CPU cores, can be GPU cores, you can see audio interface, Wi-Fi, or memory interface, many different kinds of logic processing. But the key is that it's all within a single piece of silicon, and we're often found in our consumer mobile devices. For context into how it fits into the broader logic market size, the application processor market actually is second in terms of the overall space, just behind, or not just behind CPUs, behind CPUs, but making up about 1/5 of the overall logic revenue for 2019. Now, where do we find APUs? Naturally, you're going to, we all probably assume they're in our smartphones. That's correct. That's where APUs even started. Back in 2007, I think many credit the first Apple smartphone, or the first iPhone is having that first APU, combining CPU and GPU elements into the same spot. And that's really evolved tremendously over the last decade. So starting in smartphones and then evolving into tablets and the low power features of the APU really makes it an attractive processor for other edge devices like smartwatch, other wearables, and even we're seeing them in smart speakers. They're showing up in smart TVs now, and so really in the thematic that we're seeing, looking at here, the march towards kind of more augmented intelligence takes place over the next 15, 20 years. APUs are playing a key role in that because of their they're good power efficiencies, but also very strong leading edge computational power. And then how do APUs fit within the broader semi space? So in terms of semiconductor manufacturing, as well as just the foundry space. So the chart on the left is if we look at just foundry, all foundry and independent logic, wafer capacity, APUs actually only make up about 7% of those wafers in terms of 300 millimeter equivalents. What it does, but if we also split that into leading edge on the right and kind of lagging edge in the orange on the left, then we see that APUs are also more like 20% of the leading edge volume. So yeah, it's a small piece in terms of total logic, total foundry, but it's skewed much towards the leading edge of processing. Therefore, it's a good bellwether for where bigger pieces of the industry are heading. Also, in terms of foundry revenue, if we compare the quarterly foundry revenue assigned to associated with the manufacture of application processors, we see it runs at about 20 to 25% of the overall quarterly run rate of all foundries. So a sizable chunk of this space is taken within, and it's also a very tangible processor for all of us, because we all have smartphones in our pockets. We all have many of us have tablets and smartwatches. So whereas like data center processors can feel somewhat of a black box because none of us interact with the data center physically, but we all have these little screens attached to us that have an APU behind them. So how do we see the market fundamentals shape up? What our model really looks at, we look at revenue both to the designers and to the foundries. We look at total shipments, of course, and we look at pricing a couple of different ways. On the bottom left, you see a price per billion transistors. That's the goal there is to boil down the pricing metric down to a standard unit of computational capability. Granted, a transistor built on 7 or 5 nanometer is still not equivalent to a transistor built on 20 nanometer. There's still going to be have a lower power. It's going to be lower power and faster regardless. But in this sense, we at least are trying to normalize to that cadence. And then pricing per unit on a whole, this being it's a standard or a custom build kind of a business. These range all over the place and can stay somewhat constant within a given product type and within a given segment. But on the overall blend, we see this increasing modestly through time as the processing costs continue to increase on leading edge nodes. And we'll dive into these a little bit closer as we talk, and of course, as we talk about the COVID impact. So in terms of units, the long range forecast, you can see the amount of dip we see from the COVID-19 impact. And taking this as a whole, what jumps out is that the APU space is really dominated by smartphones, with today about 3/4 of, or maybe let's forget about today since today's a dip, but late last year, 3/4 of all APUs were shipped in smartphones, and we still expect that to live north of 65% out in 2025. But there are some interesting pockets of growth in this view, where you have so certainly like one of the growth rates that jumps out is the APU based notebook CAGR. That's 49% is huge, especially in notebooks where that's generally thought of as a declining segment overall, and it is somewhat as things switch to be a more mobile space, but the APU based notebook is actually increasing, because what you have there is APUs are gaining foothold in Chromebooks. Chromebooks are perhaps a lower end version of like the always on, always connected kind of interface. And then you also have, even recently as 2 days ago and rumored up until then, Apple announcing that they're going to switch from Intel to Apple Silicon for their MacBook. So that's a big boon for application processors in the notebook space, moving them from single-digit % of overall notebooks to as high teens % by 2025. So even though smartphone APUs as a total % of units is dropping from 3/4, so from about 75% down to about 65%, we actually have their revenue associated with smartphone APUs we have that growing, or sorry, not growing, but it's holding constant at about 80% through the forecast. And what's going on there is the smartphone APU is, especially in flagship and luxury smartphones, those are the APUs that are running at the very far front edge of technology, and are seeing the highest processing costs. That they're running the most complex processing and seeing the highest processing costs, whereas some of these other segments within that APUs get, like such as smart speaker or such as an AR or VR, these tend to get either an older version or a derivative of a smartphone processor, while the smartphone space is really where like the leading edge stuff tends to end up. Smartphone and APU based notebooks. And then to explore this idea a little bit more of the price per a single unit of computational capability. So if Moore's law says that every 2 years density doubles and cost drops by half, then we should be seeing 30% declines year over year in this space. And naturally, we're all not surprised that this is slower than that, because we've been talking about Moore's law being dead or on life support for a few years now. But so you see, we're already in the middle of an inflection point as far as that's concerned, and we expect that those year-on-year price declines normalize to a unit of computational capability to get into more of the low teens % range as 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer gain steam. Yes, those are coming with still large gains in areal transistor density, areal logic density, but what we expect is that the processing cost of those to enable gate all around and nanowire kind of processing, that's we don't see the cost of that processing to completely make up for that areal gain, or that density gain. So what essentially what you see here is a slowing down of that cost decline. Okay, so the point of the webcast is to talk about the COVID impact as well. So we'll get into that. So near term, certainly want to highlight the changes in our forecast as we respond to the COVID impact. What we have seen is with both in revenue and shipments is about within a given quarter about 20% decline in terms of Q1, Q2, and Q3 of 2020. Not as much of an impact expecting Q4 20. That's where, if you look around the world at various economies, there's there's some, we're figuring out what new normal looks like, and people are getting more comfortable with consuming consuming goods and buying technology and doing things there. What makes some, and there's also pent up demand. So for the first few quarters of this, that people who would have been looking to refresh upgrade their smartphone or other consumer device, maybe have been holding off on that, and that we see that pent up demand returning at the end of 2020 and carrying forward into 2021. On the pricing side, you don't see very large swings in terms of pricing, both in terms of per area of silicon as well as the overall per unit. This is, APUs are not a highly commoditized kind of market, and so and thus these are also very much custom build kind of products. So the prices don't move around a whole lot, and the price movement you do see, in fact, is more of a change in the mix in the blend. So what's hardest hit? Obviously, we're talking about a lot of consumer devices here, and while I wouldn't personally consider my smartphone a luxury item, it's critical, a critical tool for me to do my work. At the same time, the idea that I would go and upgrade it to the latest model, I consider that to align to the luxury good mindset. So I think that's what we're seeing is a lot of the replacements of existing electronic goods being delayed during this time, and that's what we're seeing, and especially things like smartwatches, smart speakers, and of course smartphones. Now the bright spots are there's a lot of us have had to shift to working from home or doing school from home, and that has actually highlighted somewhere we have bottlenecks in our home technology experiences. So that's even creating some demand for tablets and notebooks where there was none before, especially in terms of Chromebooks, where I know of at least US based, and there's a lot of school districts that had to quickly procure a lot more Chromebooks to make sure all the kids had ample resources to continue class from home. So and about 10% of Chromebooks contain APU-based processors. So that's an interesting flip side to the COVID-19 impact. So one additional item we wanted to cover, just because it's been recently in the news, and it's also it plays a major role in the application processor market, is the trade tensions between Huawei or between China and the U.S. So it's a lot going on with this slide. We're not going to talk through all of this, but I wanted to make sure we acknowledge how we're thinking about that in the modeling of the space. So looking at specifically, the quote unquote losers of these trade tensions, Huawei and HiSilicon are certainly, specifically named in the U.S. Department of Commerce entity list. So therefore, they are officially restricted from technologies critical to them. And then TSMC is their foundry of choice. So there's going to be a loss of orders there from HiSilicon to TSMC. However, you'll notice we also call out TSMC as a potential winner, because TSMC is also the foundry of choice for anyone else who may any other OEMs who may benefit, may see an increase in their demand from Huawei losing theirs. TSMC could benefit there. Also, TSMC has shown a willingness to play along with the U.S. on this, and in fact, announced plans to build a fab in Arizona. So that's additional. So TSMC is playing both sides, and probably will do fine. There's a lot of different add-on effects that could play out with with all of this, you know, does whoever Huawei turns to supply processors, are they also targeted? Yeah, that sort of thing. We're not gonna model all of that right now. It's all too fluid to really play out through the base model. What we do recognize is that SMIC is gaining orders from Huawei to bypass the restrictions that have been placed on them. And now SMIC doesn't have the most leading edge technology, so they're not able to make all of the processors for Huawei, but there's you know, some, and you know, we estimate up to half of Huawei's processors could potentially be made on an SMIC process. But these are also the lagging, the lower end kinds of processors. So that's where the challenge really comes in. Is I don't know that Huawei really does well with only half of their bread and butter. So there's certainly questions for them to figure out. You know, future speculation is there's lots more that can happen. Huawei is China's technological crown jewel, and I'm waiting for kind of the next shoe to drop on what China does in terms of this, but I suspect maybe the whole world is maybe waiting until you know, later this year if see if there's see if there's any change in the U.S. political situation that could reshuffle all of this. So quarterly revenue, you know, as recently as Q3 of 19, that was the first quarter to top $9 billion for application processors. We would have expected Q3 of 20 to be even higher. The cyclicality tending to run highest in Q3. However, with the COVID impact, as well as, you know, weak seasonality early on, the first half of the year is really getting pushed down and climbing out from that COVID dip. We don't see getting above that 9 billion mark until first or second quarter of 2021, excuse me. And then when we think about the production metrics, the manufacturing metrics of the application processor space, you know, it's a fabless and foundry, predominantly a fabless and foundry kind of environment. So there's a few different dynamics at play here. Designers work with IP vendors and with foundries to produce a product, and of course all the semi-cap players are key in that foundry space. I'm not even showing the assembly and test houses that are also critical here to package these processors. I didn't have room on the slide, but it's a complicated space with a lot of players, and it's important to acknowledge that. And one good thing about covering APUs is that you get that exposure to how the foundry and fabless players have to cooperate in order to bring their products to market. When we look at overall wafers by process node, one of the aspects of the model is we break it down by node and by foundry as well. And this is a space that has required roughly 200,000 wafers per month in order to satisfy. You see the impact of COVID dropping the wafer output by about 20% in 2020 or early 2020, and then climbing back up. We assume to climb back up into 2021, and the growth in units, as well as in some cases perhaps even larger die sizes coming into play in some of the segments, mean that by 2025 we could see north of 240,000 wafers per month needed to satisfy this segment. And then in terms of the foundry revenue, so this is, you know, another interesting part of this space, and you can see the cyclicality here as well. We see that within a given quarter running at about $4 billion, $3 to $4 billion in recent history, though also expected to grow here. So with more wafers is going to become more foundry revenue, and also those wafers running at 5 nanometer and 3 nanometer, those processing costs expected to grow exponentially, and also command more front-end wafer processing services revenue. And then I think finally a note on CAPEX. So the amount of investment just for front-end processing equipment for this space runs recent history at about $4 billion per year, and as both wafer volumes would need to increase, as well as the additional complexity of 5 and 3 nanometers and beyond, we expect that to grow up to nearly $8 billion by 2025. As you know, mainly it's TSMC. Samsung is also a big player here. There's an element of others that also come into play here. I mentioned SMIC is picking up application processor orders, but you also have some global foundries. You also have some Intel even in here, accounting for that. So, so final thoughts. APUs are important. They get it's the processor that we all have in the palm of our hands. The kind of processor we all have. Near term, it's certainly impacted by COVID because of major impacts in the consumer electronics space, as well as impacts just to the overall electronic supply chain. And the China and US trade tensions are not making it any easier, but also it's creating some dynamic chaos in the system somewhat, and there are going to be some people that win from that as well. It's a market that we expect to still garner $31 billion of revenue for designers in 2020, and see that growing up to north of $50 billion by 2024. And we have, so just a note on what we have within the monitor. We've brought in smartphone, tablet, smartwatch, smart speaker, augmented reality, virtual reality, smart TV, and ultralight PC. All of that's covered within the monitor now. Next quarter, we'll be adding an automotive infotainment module as well. And then what we have also to come is a processor logic monitor where we jump headfirst into CPU and GPU, so stepping away from the APU space, and then integrating in an FPGA piece as well in second quarter. Okay, I think so. We're going to open up for questions that we've received.
Yep. Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. And now we will begin the Q&A session. We got a few questions for you, John. So the first one would be, is there a potential for APUs to penetrate the data center or cloud computing space?
Yeah, a good question. So that's actually one reason why we wanted to get very specific in how we define APU. Is there's one way to think about APUs as being ARM based. So defining it as an APU because it's based on a RISC or ARM kind of architecture, and that's tempting, but that's not what we chose. We wanted to have it be something that's combining multiple elements. And so what you have in the data center space is you do have some ARM based processors coming in. For instance, there's a Huawei Kunpeng processor that is slated towards data center, and there's interesting things there that are built even probably based on learning from application processors. Though I think at this point we would still classify those as CPUs, as they're dedicated to the compute function, and that the GPUs are GPUs showing up into that would still be a standalone GPU as well, and the low powerness of an APU is so attractive to the edge, and yes, it can be a constraint on for data centers as well, to make sure that they are living within power constraints. But in terms of you're not worried about like the life of a battery in the data center. So I guess long way to say, probably not, at least not near term. There's always new usage cases going on, but at least the trend within data center has been that they can live within a larger power envelope. Therefore, they go and go with really big and powerful CPUs and GPUs.
Right, thanks. Second question for you. In the segments that both have APU and CPUs, how do APUs compare to their x86 based competitions?
So yeah, the challenge for, and really this segment specifically that those two compete in is more in the notebook space. The challenge for APUs there is that x86 and just the Windows operating system have evolved together for so long that it'd be hard. It's hard to get a foothold in for another type of hardware. That said, you do see penetration in Chromebooks, and the reason you see that is because the APU has better low power management, and Chromebooks is kind of that leading edge, or is a subset of notebooks that also exists in Windows notebooks, of kind of always on, always connected, and that's where the growth is within notebooks, is those kinds of notebooks. So there's still a small portion, but it is expected to grow. In fact, there's Windows-based processors that are shipping with Snapdragon based. So there's Windows-based laptops shipping with Snapdragon-based processors this year, and these ones are quite nice. These aren't just low-end kind of laptops. I think the real feather in the cap for APUs is seeing Apple choose to make that switch with their first Apple Silicon processor in a laptop will be later this year, and so that's really showing that they believe in that, and they see enough of it, and if Apple putting something in not everybody goes to follow what Apple does, but they certainly are a leader for portions of the market. For instance, they did smartphones, then everybody else was doing smartphones, they were doing tablets, everyone was doing tablets, and seeing Apple bring in a APU-based processor for a notebook is probably is something that says the performance parity is there, if not better, if you factor in the power management.
Right. Thank you. We are running out of time, so we will stop the Q&A session right now. However, for the remaining questions, because there is a few other ones, we will answer directly the person by email. So don't worry. So the live market briefing is now ending. Thank you very much, John, for your time and expertise. Just before leaving, let me remind you that you will receive tomorrow the link to the recorded session of this live webcast. So you can also share this presentation as well as the recorded session to some of your colleagues. Lastly, let me remind you that you can find all our products on our website, i-micronews.com, all our market reports, monitors, and tracks. So do not hesitate to continue to send questions. We will also answer them later on. You can find all the details for contacting us on the last slide of this presentation. Thank you for joining us today. Have a good day and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.